Hi, hello. My name is Ben. I am here to give a talk on finding plaintext passwords in enterprise environments. I've got about 25 slides and about 25 minutes, so this might be a bit of a speed run, so we're going to try and get through it as quick as we can. If you all have any questions at any point, feel free to raise a hand, or you can talk afterwards, or you can find me afterwards, or hit me up on Twitter or whatever. But yeah, let's get started. So just a brief agenda. We'll talk about who I am. We'll talk about what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about file shares, network file shares specifically. And I'm going to hit play so I can time myself. I forgot that part. There we go. Active Directory metadata, CID Services, some stuff about Canaries, last resort, final shot in the dark, auditing, takeaways, et cetera, et cetera. We can jump right in. So as I said before, hello, my name is Ben. I'm a pen tester at Black Hills Information Security. My social stuff is on there. I'm based out of Chicago, Illinois. I've been testing and consulting for the better part of about 6 years now. I was in the bar industry for a long time before that, so one of those fun, non-traditional paths into information security that everyone seems to have. Here's a kind of sample of some cool projects that I worked on. Some APT, incident response, a bunch of cloud security audits, a ton of pen tests, mostly internal and assumed compromise is what I focus on these days. So a lot of reporting. A lot of writing, which is the other thing that people don't tell you about being a pen tester, is 98% of it is writing. I've given a handful of other talks, which can be found on the internet. There's a really good one that I gave about soft skills at Black Hills you can find on YouTube if you're interested. And also just about how to leverage non-information security experiences into applicable skills in this field. There's a list of things that I enjoy, which I feel like everyone's kind of obligated to put into these types of presentations. This is my dog, my fiance's dog, my fiance and I's dog, Louise. She's a retired racing greyhound that we adopted about 2 years ago, and we're obsessed with her. So what I'm not going to talk about today is a lot of things, right? I'm not going to talk about coercion methods. There's a number of other really great talks and information resources out there about the multitude of different ways that you can coerce machines and things inside Active Directory environments to relay credentials and authentication data. My coworker Gabriel just did a really great talk a few months ago called The First Cred is the Deepest. So if you're interested in credential relaying and coercion in general, I would recommend go checking that out. This is an ADCS stuff. I know that's kind of been the bleeding edge instant domain admin ticket for the last, 18 months or so since that white paper came out. This is not about that. This is not about cloud, AWS, any sort of like external discovery exposure type work. There are other people doing better work. This isn't to talk about password cracking. Although I do love password cracking, I do not claim to be good at it, but I enjoy it. And also, this isn't bleeding edge research, right? I'm not a developer. I worked in bars for a long time. I kind of found myself here doing what I'm doing, but I don't have the kind of hardcore programmatic computer science knowledge or background to really develop a whole lot of tools or like speak to those kind of lower level ways that things work. So this isn't hardcore bleeding edge research, but stuff that I found, stuff that I think is interesting, stuff that I wanted to try and share. So yeah, that's what we're not going to be talking about today. But what are we going to be talking about? A lot of this is going to be focused on network file shares and interesting places to find passwords and credentials on those network file shares. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this type of attack path is it's not necessarily an exploitable vulnerability per se, right? Like you're finding credentials somewhere in an environment. Those credentials have to live somewhere in an environment, right? Developers need credentials, you need secret management, you need passwords, you need cryptographic keys, you need all sorts of those things to function, to run programs and to do your job and for networks to exist and work. And so, those things are there. They're kind of intended to be there, they're intended to be used. But finding those things and taking advantage of those things, theoretically, if you do those in a sneaky enough way, also shouldn't really generate alerts, right? Like granted, there could be alerts around maybe elevated groups performing certain actions or something like that, but if you find a password and then attempt to log on as that user with that password, that's something that user would also do on a regular basis, right? So it's kind of a non-breach breach, I would say, where you're using intended credentials for their intended functionality, but you're just impersonating a user or a context. We're going to be talking about some tools, but mostly ideas and ways that we can do this better. And some of the things that I found interesting over doing this for the last couple of years. Has anyone seen this Country magazine before down here? You guys have seen this? I feel like this is kind of a fever dream that I lived through that not a whole lot of other people have seen or heard of, but my grandmother had a subscription to this. And I would go spend time on her farm in Ohio, And in every one of these issues, there was a tiny little image of a needle that was just hidden somewhere randomly in the magazine. And you didn't win anything. There wasn't really like a point. It was just kind of a game to like flip through the magazine and try and find this tiny little hidden needle. So as a kid, on a farm in Ohio, I spent a lot of time flipping through this magazine trying to find that needle. And I think that's kind of one of the things that made this type of work enjoyable to me, or this type of work, or this part of this type of work, sorry. Yeah, and so why is this stuff important? We all saw the Uber breach, whenever that was. It feels like 3 months, but it was probably a year and a half ago. But that was a PowerShell script on a network file share that had admin creds on it that led to full compromise of that environment. So the potential impact of these things is quite large, and it's not something that there's a quick and easy fix for, but something that takes time and energy and a lot of work to kind of cull and audit and maintain and try and cut back on. So let's get into it. I'm talking about network file shares. Like I said, the creep is the realest thing, right? I'm sure we've all been at organizations or done tests for organizations that are super old, and for some reason, God knows why, there's a network file share that's got files on it from 2008, right? Those are in an open share that everyone can get to, and there's probably no reason that a large percent of the organization needs access to those files, but they're there, right? And honestly, in the last, 2 or 3 years of testing, I would say domain admin paths for me, more than any other attack path, have been finding credentials in network file shares. Whether those be SQL credentials, hard-coded in some sort of web config file, whether those are just straight domain credentials in some sort of batch script or like PS1, like user provisioning script, that's gotten me a lot of wins. And it's also something that it kind of takes a lot of time to dig through and find, right? Like a lot of local privilege escalation checks you can do pretty quickly. A lot of Active Directory potential attack paths you can enumerate and check and rule out pretty quickly. A lot of ADCS stuff you can rule out pretty quickly. But a lot of the network file share stuff, there are tools to kind of quickly look through all of that. But a lot of that too just takes time and energy and like manually clicking through and seeing what you can find and hoping that you get lucky for the most part. Like I said before, there probably should be alerting around using privileged accounts, but a lot of times there isn't. So a lot of times you can find these old service accounts and things like that and use those passwords and fly under the radar a little bit. Not a lot of really great tooling. I've got some samples and ideas for stuff that we can do better towards the end of the presentation that help. But there's not a lot of great, like, easy technical solutions to kind of cutting back on that. So first and foremost, my favorite tool to do this type of work is Snaffler. This is an executable binary. I thought it was super cool when I found this tool and no one else had heard of it, and then I went to work somewhere else and everyone else had also heard of it. So probably a lot of you have also heard of this, but Snaffler is my favorite tool for doing this type of work and trying to find these types of files. You simply just run it, and it'll run as the user context under which you execute the program. It'll check Active Directory for whatever shares might exist in the environment. It'll check whatever shares your user has the ability and rights to access. It'll also check for interesting files on those shares, right? So it'll do some light grepping of like file names themselves, looking for words like password within the file name. It'll also look for sensitive extensions like .pem and stuff like that. It puts out a ton of output. A lot of it's false positives, but sometimes it's good to have a lot of output to jump off from. That's also the downside, is there's a ton of output, and if you want to try and make this a more actionable tool for regular use, it definitely takes a little bit of like tuning those results and cutting out what you need and what you don't need to make it actually valuable to you as a tester or an auditor. Let's see. So one of the things that I found with Snaffler too, running it against a C drive is really helpful. You can, if you just run it by itself, it'll check for file shares, but running it against a C drive will look for interesting or sensitive files on that drive. I know there's a lot of other tools like situational awareness tools that'll do that for you, but having one that just checks for files, I think, is a nice kind of thing to have in your pocket as a tester. So some of the places that I think are specifically worth manually investigating when it comes to network file shares in enterprise environments, recently terminated employees folders. I feel like we see this happen a lot, especially with the kind of turnover that's been happening in the last year or so. People get fired. Those people have a ton of data. You know, the place that they get fired, they don't necessarily know who needs that data once that person gets let go. So that might just get stuck on a drive somewhere to hang out until someone figures out who's going to inherit that data, who's going to inherit those job responsibilities. This is also an opportunity where there are a lot of process failures that could exist, right? Like a lot of organizations might have really great automated processes for doing this type of work, disabling that user, moving their files somewhere safe and kind of backing that stuff up. But a lot of that's still done manually. So there is a lot of opportunity for process failures in that type of function. Another place that's really interesting to check is scan upload folders. I feel like you see these a lot too, where everything that gets scanned gets sent to one main folder. There may be granular individual folders for users who upload those documents, but I just finished a test last week where everyone had their own folder, but you could still access every one of those folders. So within that folder were, scanned medical documents of the CEO's kids and, tax data for other executives and stuff like that. So that's always an interesting place that's worth checking. A lot of those file names from those scanning appliances are just like scan01. So if you're not going in there and manually checking what scan01 is, you might miss something sensitive that's worth writing up, right? Another thing that's interesting that I found is OneNote backups. I'm not sure if SNAF specifically hits on these like .1 files or has the ability to scan them themselves, but they're pretty easy to export and load those locally. You'll find a lot of passwords in there that people just use as their little notepad and store a bunch of creds in. Sysvol is another easy win. We all know that there's groups and XML files and stuff like that that might have cached GPP passwords and stuff, but there's also a lot of scripts and deployment scripts and provisioning scripts that I have found credentials in more times than not, so always check Sysvol for potentially sensitive information. Web.config files, I could have talked about that a little bit already, but you'll often see connection strings for SQL environments or SQL servers. So those are really great footholds for either enabling command execution on that SQL server itself or just straight up accessing whatever sensitive data is in that SQL database. And then I mentioned batch scripts and PS1 scripts already. So the first time that I gave this presentation, I had the really brilliant idea of having actual screenshots from engagements, carefully, heavily redacted screenshots. And I called my boss an hour before I was supposed to give that presentation, and he said, please, dear God, do not do that. So this is not real life, but this is an example of what it looks like to find a .1 file and then load that locally and then open it up and find a recipe for pancakes. Another thing that I found recently that I thought was pretty cool, I don't know how aware anyone is of this. This was new to me, but I did find SQL credentials on an engagement. I didn't have the ability to install new tools in the box. I didn't have ability to get on some sort of like Kali image or anything to run the usual tools that I might be using. But I wasn't aware that Microsoft Excel has SQL integrators built into it. So this screenshot here is showing how to connect to an Azure SQL database, but right above that, you can connect to any other local database or a database on the network and just pop in those creds that you find and straight up access the data that way, which I thought was kind of cool and interesting and new to me. Another thing that I found that's been really fruitful in the last few months is finding VMDKs on network file shares. A lot of times these will get put out there because sysadmins need them to deploy images or just to back them up or what have you. But a really cool thing that I found is you can interact with those VMDKs and VDIs and all those sorts of those other virtual machine images with 7-zip. And once you open that up with 7-zip, you can dump copies of SAM, security, and system. You can then exfiltrate those to a local machine that you control and then run whatever sorts of tooling you want against those and potentially recover secrets from that data that way. So I did that and found a local admin password that had been reused throughout the environment and got me footholds on multiple other machines. So that's the kind of, also you can, if you really wanted, you could exfiltrate that whole VMDK and spin up that machine on your own and try and get on it and do whatever you wanted to do. But I feel like dumping the creds is the quick, easy win to kind of take what you want from it and move on. SharePoint, so like SNAF, there's a really great tool for scraping SharePoint called SNAFpoint. It creates a bearer token, so it's got like the Azure login flow. It'll prompt a little window. You can log in with your Office 365 credentials, and then it'll try and search SharePoint for potentially interesting or sensitive files. Another thing about SharePoint is it's got a built-in search bar, right? Like I can't tell you how many times I've tried to log on to Office 365 as a test user, just gone to SharePoint and searched for the word password and found Excel documents with passwords in them that way. So the access controls for SharePoint can be just as hard and annoying and convoluted as they are for on-prem network file shares. So that's another good place to look for sensitive data. Moving on, Active Directory metadata. This was another relatively new thing to me that everyone else might know about already, but I thought was kind of cool. But a lot of lazy sysadmins, and this is no shade to anyone because I'm the laziest person in the world, will put passwords in Active Directory metadata. So the tool that I would usually use to interact with that is Active Directory Explorer. This is a native Windows sysinternals tool. Because it's a native Windows tool, it's pretty easy to get onto a box and run. You can search whatever field you want for potentially interesting information. I've seen passwords in the description field. I've seen passcodes for VoIP devices in the comment field. A lot of times there will be specific descriptions of why a person was let go or what this account was provisioned for. Excuse me, but there's often password was reset on this date to this, and it might not have been changed since, so that's a great place to look. Here's some one-liners too for scraping that data if you don't want to download and install Active Directory Explorer. My old coworker Sally also has a really good blog on using AD Explorer for some more offensive tradecraft if you're interested in checking that out. The other cool thing about AD Explorer is you can create snapshots of Active Directory environments. So if you're having trouble getting Bloodhound up and running and you want to try and create a general snapshot of the environment for you to investigate, you can do that with Active Directory Explorer. There's a really great Python tool that'll convert that Active Directory Explorer snapshot into data that can be ingested by Bloodhound. It's pretty sneaky. I think the only real detections for that are like LDAP, large traffic queries, but it's not as great of a picture as you would want from like, noisy, loud Bloodhound, but it is, a good jumping off point for finding potential attack paths. If you have Bloodhound data already, you can also search the metadata from Active Directory within Bloodhound using Cypher queries. So that's something that I feel like I'm never good at, is using the actual raw query function of Bloodhound, but it is possible to kind of scrape through that data that way too. CID Services, this is obviously, like I was talking about before with developers, there are legitimate uses and reasons and needs that people need credentials and credential management. There are a lot of lazy people, myself included, out there that hard code credentials in scripts that save credentials in notes and then forget those notes exist. So anytime you get access to a CIDC service like Jenkins or BitBucket or anything like that, you can use the built-in search bar to search for sensitive strings that might be of interest. You can also use tools like TruffleHog that'll try and scrape some of those publicly available services like GitHub and stuff like that for potentially sensitive data. From like an external internet user perspective, I made a note that like I said, there are probably other better talks for what that asset discovery and enumeration kind of looks like. But I have found internal versions of this and found stuff on there, so I wanted to kind of call that out too. So this was supposed to be another reality of something that I found on an engagement, but I found domain creds for a BitBucket user. I found an internally accessible BitBucket service, just searched for the string password on that BitBucket service and found hard-coded domain credentials within a config file in BitBucket that had me admin on 2 or 3 other machines, and then you kind of rinse and repeat. Another thing that we've seen a lot of lately that I don't do as much as I should, but I do think is interesting, is scraping and debugging customer-created tools. So we've had a handful of tests where we found some sort of program that a client has developed internally. We've attached a debugger to that or tried to decompile that tool, ran strings against that tool, found out that there were hard-coded credentials coded within that program. That is a program that are also used by that client's other customers around the world. And then you kind of have to have an uncomfortable conversation with that client about what other sorts of risks they might be introducing to their clients. But that is something that we've seen, and I would recommend checking. I'm not great at debugging, like I said before, but it is a viable attack path, especially if there's password reuse, and things aren't being developed and coded securely and managing credentials and secrets securely. I wrote a note that strings is your friend. Strings is the coolest tool and can be used for everything, I would say. I wanted to put a note in here too about Canaries. As we're talking about finding Excel docs called passwords.excel, which are very real and often have very real passwords, we also find passwords.excel that are not real and are canary tokens within an environment. It depends what your OPSEC is like on your test, right? You're in charge of that if you're trying to be sneaky. If you've got, 5 weeks to do whatever you want to do, then yeah, maybe don't open that canary token. If you've got 5 days to try and demonstrate impact to a client, yeah, maybe you go for it, Sometimes you have to. I will say on that note too, one thing that clients love is when I trigger canary tokens. They love nothing more than sending me an email saying, hey, was this you? We got you. And validation and verification that those security controls and tools are working as they are intended to be working also provides value in an engagement, right? So don't be afraid to open passwords.xls even though you think it might be fake. Another thing I've seen a lot, which is just kind of funny and not necessarily particularly useful, but I see this a lot in financial firms where the password protected documents need to be password protected, but the name of the file has the password for the file in the document. I've seen that a lot, so that's just kind of a lull, but it exists. So for some last resorts, if you can't find anything anywhere, I've had this work a handful of times where you're just running raw traffic captures if you can, and then trying to scrape those PCAPs with tools to see if there's any sensitive HTTP plaintext authentication stuff in those PCAPs, or maybe some NTLM data you can pull out of those PCAPs. Another thing that you can do with this, SNAFler will detect PCAPs on network file shares too. So if you can find a trove of PCAPs that some sysadmin might have left behind from testing something, you can scrape through those and see if you can find potentially sensitive information in that traffic as well, which is kind of a cool attack path. When it comes to auditing and trying to keep all of this stuff in check, there's a handful of things, but nothing is really going to go out there and kind of do it for you. One of the things that came out within the last few months that's cool is this Power Hunt shares from NetSpy. So this is kind of I would say more of an auditor's blue team defensive type tool, excuse me, that's going to generate a lot of really actionable reports about which shares exist, which shares have the most access, which shares have the most number of users that are allowed to access those shares and stuff like that. That's kind of a good jumping off point for doing a baseline audit of like what your environment looks like when it comes to this type of exposure. So I'd recommend checking that out. That's open source and free. Another thing is like running SNAFler on a regular basis. This is my little one-liner for grepping out the file portion of SNAFler, but say you run it like one quarter and you try and get like a line count of how many items it found, and then you run it again next quarter and see if that number has changed. Obviously you can run down the actual files that it found from this information, but trying to do that on a regular basis just to kind of keep that stuff in check and keep like kind of an overall view of what's happening and how it's growing or how it's shrinking, I feel like is the important thing that needs to happen with this type of stuff. Okay, and last takeaways, right? These things are hard to fix. If they were not hard to fix, they wouldn't get us DA on 9 out of 10 tests, right? Like these are process failures, and regardless of whatever technical controls or implementations an organization puts in place, there needs to be buy-in for those, right? Like I can't tell you how many clients we've tested that roll out LastPass, that roll out Okta single sign-on, and all sorts of technologies that they're paying good money for. And there's still someone who saves a password plain text in a notepad on a network file share, right? Or an Excel document. And you know, it just happens. People are lazy. And I'm the person who also does that, right? Like I do that on every test. I've got a notepad that I spin up just for that test. I'm gonna paste stuff in there. I'm not putting it on a network file share, but you know, we're all kind of guilty of using those shortcuts when we need to copy paste in between VMs and all these other sorts of crazy hypervisor solutions and stuff. So there's no easy, quick solution for it. And unfortunately, that's good for us as pen testers, but that's bad for organizations that are trying to minimize that exposure from plain text passwords hanging out in an environment. So it really just takes work and finding that balance between usability and security. Because if something's too hard to use, people are going to find ways around it, and it's not going to matter what sorts of tools are in place to try and prevent that, because people are going to find a way. Last slide, I've got a bunch of links. So most of the things that I talked about, there's links on here. I'm not sure. If you want the slides, you can hit me up on Twitter, or I'll post them somewhere, I'm not sure. But here's a bunch of links if you want them for most of the things that I talked about. And then also a brief 5-minute section for questions, if anyone has any. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I think SNAFler does the similar thing, right? It might be a little bit easier. The reporting that comes out of the NetSpy Power Hunt shares tool is like HTML reporting, but SNAFler will do the same thing as far as showing what shares are accessible to you as a user. I think the value of the NetSpy tool is showing which shares are accessible to the most users from like an auditing perspective, if that makes sense. Like which ones might be overly permissive when they shouldn't be or something like that, but yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah, cool. Yeah. So the question was, have I seen detections or alerting based on the generation of PCAPs and network traffic capture? Is that right? I haven't specifically. I don't know if those things exist. I'm sure that from like an endpoint detection level, there's probably a way that you could do that. The tests that I've done that on usually are ones where we drop an implant on the network that we control that we can put whatever we want on. So the caveat to that is you need the ability to sniff traffic in a promiscuous manner and capture that. So, but yeah, I don't know if I've seen that personally, but I'm sure it exists. Anybody else? Marco? What? Can you go back to the link page? Yeah, for sure. Sorry, that was loud. Is that a hand? Oh, yeah, sorry, the lights are bright. Yeah. So you're asking how can we do the most in the shortest amount of time, is that correct? Yeah, I guess how do we garner enough respect? Yeah, I mean, I think it's cultural, right? I think it depends on the organization. There's a lot of organizations that take a very proactive approach to bolstering their own security and do things of their own volition, of their own accord. There's a lot of organizations that are very reactive, right? And only have an influx of budget when an incident happens and there's a bunch of money because there's a breach, and then after that, it kind of depends. I think demonstrating the potential impact of not fixing those things is the main takeaway, right? Like if you can say, because we didn't do X, Y, Z, here's the CEO's social security number, or here's a database of all of our clients. I think demonstrating the potential impact is like the one takeaway of why things probably should be fixed. Does that answer the question? Yeah, cool. Awesome, anybody else? Sorry, the lights are bright. Cool, well, thank you.